Hey guys, I recently picked up a new camera, the Fujifilm XS10, and I wanted to give you guys a review from a perspective of a Fuji XT2 owner. Now I did pick this up with my own money, Amazon, just under $1,000. I think it was like $9.99, $9.98. And to summarize this video in a quick second is I'm going to send this camera back, and I didn't buy it just to do a review and send it back. I really had high hopes for this camera. It had a lot of the boxes checked for me. It was a smaller form factor than the XT series. It had great autofocus. It had a fully articulating screen, a flippy screen, like the XT4. It had IBIS in-body stabilization. And those were some of the key things for me. Oh, and the bigger grip. There are a few other things that really were important that this camera solved for. One was the video button. I often do a hybrid shooting for vacations, and I thought this camera, it was smaller, it was lighter, it had all of these things like a selfie screen. But when we go on family vacations, I just find that if I have a selfie screen, I'm in more of the family photos and videos than not. So that was important, but I like to switch between video and stills. And with the Fuji XT2, one of the problems that I have is the primes. I love shooting Fuji primes. They're fast, meaning you can use them in lower light and you have that wide aperture, but you get a lot of micro jitters. I was in Disney World and shot some video, and the footage was unusable. So that's where IBIS really is important for me. I can shoot with the prime lens, but also be able to flip real quick into video mode and take some family videos. I really don't do anything crazy. I just put them together for a memory video. What I liked about this camera is it had this orange button, this video button, where it's just an auto everything button in video. So you could have everything dialed in for your still photos, hit that, and boom, you're taking a quick video. So that was really cool feature for me. So why am I thinking about sending this back? Let's go through some of the pros and some of the maybe not so bad, not so goods, and some of the things that were, to me, were flat out negatives. Starting with the pros, the size and weight. Now this camera is smaller than the XT series. This is an XT2, but the XT4 is even bigger. And one of the things that really prevented me from buying the XT4 was it grew. Now the grip grew, but the overall camera grew because the IBIS, or in-body stabilization, that they put in the camera was a little bit on the larger side. But Fuji was able to figure out a way to engineer a smaller IBIS mechanism, and it kept the smaller form factor. And I hope they adopt this on the XT5. And yeah, I'm jumping the gun a little bit. I'm hoping that the XT5 is in the same aspect as far as size as the XT2 and XT3. We'll have to wait and see. I never had a problem with autofocus on the XT2, and I know the XS10 even beats the XT3 and XT4 if you haven't done the firmware upgrade. If you do the firmware upgrade, you'll have the same advantage of the XS10, but it is much, much better than the Fuji XT2. That said, I never really had a problem. Yeah, it might not be the fastest to grab focus, but I never had a problem with the XT2. Sometimes you can have a better camera, but doesn't make your old camera any worse. So that's kind of what I always kind of relate and hold these cameras in respect to is my Fuji XT2. The image quality is great. It has the same sensor as the XT3 and XT4. The XT2 is on par with those, so the sensor really we haven't seen a big jump, a leap in sensor technology from Fuji in a while. From the XT2 to the XT3, they did go with the back-sided illumination of the sensor, and I really thought we were going to gain a lot of high dynamic range and some higher ISOs. And I've never used an XT3 or XT4. I've looked at the stills coming out of this camera, just the JPEG, and there's not much difference. The ISO advantages are very minimal, if any, between the XT2 and the newer sensor, the XT3, XT4, and this is using the same as the XT4. I think that sensor's getting a little long in the tooth, not so bad, and it's not a bad move for Fuji using it. I think that's appropriate given the price range of just under $1,000 body only. But that's another thing that really kind of kept me from the XT4. Not really any big leaps and bounds improvements on technology as far as the sensors. It's a faster camera. This takes advantage of all that speed. It's got the newer processor and everything. So it really is kind of a smaller version of the XT4. And if you really think about it, this camera is a hybrid, or an offspring of the XH series, which was their bigger camera. Again, not a fan because of the size, and the XT30. So it's a smaller camera but has a bigger grip. The audio jack, this is really cool. Fuji decided to take the mic jack and have its own little plug, so you don't have to mess with the door. I think that is great, and that is totally a winner in my books. The Joey stick. Now, I haven't actually played with an XT3 and XT4, but on the back, my XT2, it's not bad, but it's kind of much more firmer, not as responsive. The Joey stick they used on this thing, it just stood out to me. It's like butter. It's very easy to move, and it's very accurate when you're moving your focus point. So I think they've improved it, but again, they've probably improved it on the XT3 and XT4 as well. The placement of the Q button. One of the things that I don't like too much on the XT series, at least the XT2 and XT3, is when I hold it, the button placement of the Q button, it's an odd spot. So if I'm doing one hand, and that's why I have this wrist strap, I often, when I'm shooting my XT2, I do one of these. This strap is just so I don't drop my camera, and I'm often shooting one-handed. So if I want to get into my Q, I'm almost dropping my camera with one hand by going into the Q settings. That, to me, it's not the greatest placement, and yeah, it's probably not designed for one hand, because there's absolutely no problem if I use my left hand to support the camera. But with the XS camera, you got this Q button on the top, so without even moving a grip, you can easily reach the Q setting. So if you guys don't know anything about Fuji, they have a great Q setting. It's a quick menu setting. So you hit the Q button, and you can actually configure all of your things that you use most often in this one place, and they're easy to get to, easy to change. So I think that's a good improvement as well. Some of the things I wouldn't say that are bad but not great is the viewfinder. The viewfinder is the same as the XT30, which isn't bad, but isn't very good either. Comparing it to a very old camera, this is a 3 or 4 year old camera, the XT2 viewfinder is still much better. If you get into the XT3, which by the way is the exact same price on sale right now as the XS10, it completely blows it away. And I haven't actually looked at the XT3, but on numbers and what I've heard, but the XT2 is even better. It's more brighter. It's wider. You're more like in the scene versus looking at an old TV. That's what this reminds me of. It's not bad, but it's not great. So the other thing is the battery. Now, some people, they just hate the old Fujifilm batteries, and I don't. There's these smaller, lighter batteries, and if I shot professionally, yeah, that would be a big deal for me, but I don't. And these are easy to throw a couple, in your pocket even, and you don't even know they're there. And they last a while as long as you take shut your camera off. The one thing that I don't like about this camera, or it's not a huge thing, it's got one card slot, and you would expect that for a $1,000 camera. The placement isn't the easiest, but it's not really hard to get at as either. So I've had cameras that had this card in that same placement, was much harder, like my Sony A6000, or I'm sorry, A6300, same kind of location, but it was harder to get at. This one, it's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. One of the things that's kind of annoying coming from an XT series camera is the door doesn't automatically lock. You got to remember to hit that. Not a huge deal, but if you're used to the XT series, it's kind of annoying because you're just keep on flipping it down and it won't lock until you realize, yeah, I gotta hit the switch. So the dial configuration, and I knew this getting into this camera, so I'm not saying it's a negative, but you have limited dials. Yes, you have your aperture setting on your lens, and this button here or this dial here is programmed for a shutter in most cases, or compensation. You can configure that. In manual, I have mine is this is the shutter, and which I didn't have to change it. It defaulted to the shutter. I did change this dial to be my ISO, and then the lens. Not a huge deal. I much prefer the analog. I can look down and see where my settings are. So by far I prefer this, but I knew what I was getting into, and it wasn't horrible for me. I mean, most people coming from a traditional camera, they're going to be used to these settings, the aperture priority, shutter priority, program mode, and so on, full auto. With Fuji, I've kind of come accustomed and like the way they do the XT series as far as the dials go. So not better, not worse. It depends on your opinion. To me, I much prefer this, but again, I knew what I was getting into when I bought this camera, and I didn't mind it so much because this camera was going to be a small, lightweight travel camera, and mostly shooting, again, just some family videos or family photos. Wasn't huge. The D-pad, that probably pisses off some people, not me. I don't use my D-pad that much, but it does not have a D-pad, where on the XT series it does. XT series is a little bit bigger of real estate. You have more real estate. This camera's smaller, and there's a trade-off. And now I'm going to get into the negatives. There's quite a few, and let me see if I can remember them. I did take some. Need to borrow them. Hey, come on! I'm doing a video. I need to borrow them. The negative. Okay, guys, I'm back since I was rudely interrupted by my wife. So let's get into the negatives. First and foremost is the real estate and the trade-offs for the size. Now, this camera, the XS10, is smaller. It's lighter, a little bit lighter than the Fuji XT series. But when you put a lens on it, and the Fuji lenses are great. Their build quality is spectacular. They're aluminum. There's a lot of elements of glass. But once you put a decent lens on this camera body, it's like a brick. There's no difference in weight between the XT series and the XS10 when you're holding in the hand. Yes, if you look at on a scale, but as far as just trying to hold it in your hand, you're not going to tell any difference in weight. The size, same thing. In your hand, there's not really much difference in the size, and quite honestly, what you have to give up, and I didn't think about this when I bought this camera, what you have to give up is all that real estate where buttons and dials would be. And the trade-offs to me aren't worth it. And this is the number one reason why I'm going to send the XS10 back, because I just don't enjoy shooting it as much. The dials on the top, I really like that better. The placement of the buttons and the switches and the shutter release and the back button, or I use the front button focus. All of those are user experience. Since these cameras really are about the same image quality, you're picking up some video specs with the IBIS, and but that's pretty much it. Other than that, I like to shoot this. And if the weight is the same, and it's not like a huge camera, we're not talking about like a full frame DSLR. This is just a little bit bigger, but you gain so much more. So again, I didn't think about this when I got this XS10, but after I held it in my hand, I don't know what I was thinking. I was just expecting like my A6300 with a small Sigma lens. This does not feel like that. Or when I had my Canon M50, and that was a cool, lightweight, super lightweight, small, compact travel camera, but it wasn't for me for a few other reasons. I was hoping that the Fuji would kind of fit that gap for me. It's a Fujifilm camera that, was that small, lightweight contender that still had great optical quality. And it does have great optical quality, but the small, light form factor just isn't there. So if I'm not taking advantage, bring on the XT series. That's just for me. The others are the ergonomics. Now, everybody that had this camera, that they were sent this camera by Fuji and their big reviewers, they just were going freaking nuts about, oh, the grip. Oh my God, the grip. Oh my God, the grip. When I got this thing in the mail, I was like, before I put the battery in it, I was so stoked. And I wish I would have drove maybe further, but nobody locally had this camera. So I bought it from Amazon. First thing I did before I put the battery in it was just grab this grip, and it's just not that great. Everybody's hands are different. I know this, but it just didn't feel great. It was like holding a brick. And yeah, other companies have designed camera grips that do feel better in the hand. Canon is one. Maybe it's just me. They cater to my hand. Maybe my hand's the same as the designer of the Canon cameras. But every time I put my hands around a Canon camera, I was like, wow, it just feels awesome. This, I'm appreciative of a bigger grip. It just doesn't feel good. And it's just not comfortable. And when you hold it on the natural, I like shooting one-handed. Look where my index finger placement is. The shutter release, I have to arch back. Not a huge deal, but you have to arch back. And then there's a dial underneath here that's basically unusable, which I'll talk about that dial in a second. But when you're holding this thing, you can't reach that dial, and the dial don't do shit anyway, so I guess that's not a huge negative. But even the on-off switch, look, I'm trying to fight to get the on-off switch button. Part of that is the switch itself. It sucks. The other part is the way the grip is, because if I hold it two hands, it's easier. Not great. I still miss it sometimes. I don't know what Fuji was thinking about this on-off switch. It's a horrible design. And but the ergos, and then let's move to the back of the camera, still on the ergos. This AF on, what AF on is a back button focus. On the XT2, I shoot one-handed, and I don't use the back button focus, although I could, because the AFL is what I used to have defined as the back button focus, until I start using the front button. Fuji's got a button, or the XT series got a button in the front, and I can hold this camera all day long. The position of my index finger is right where it should be on the shutter release, and my middle finger is on that front button. I can lock and boom, nail. Oh, I was flipping around. I do that. I don't have the beep on, but so that's important for me, the ergos. And I was expecting this to blow the XT series away, and I prefer the XT2. Now, I do like a bigger grip. It's just I don't like this grip. Could be my hands, I'm sure that is, but that's just my take. If you guys are out there and you see Manny and these other people just like going nuts about the grip, and you're excited, like, wow, we finally got a cool grip. Yeah, don't get overly excited. It might work for you. It might be the best thing ever, but not until you try it. Don't get too excited. The other thing is, I mentioned about this front dial, which is kind of useless because you got to use two hands. You can easily reach it if you're using two hands. You can't do a push in, and I knew that. I don't know what the technical is, but you can't configure this for anything. I was thinking I'd make that my ISO, but you can't configure that, which is stupid. That's like prime real estate as far as your configurations. And for whatever reason, I don't know if they're just dumbing it down. You can't configure that. And you can't configure a lot of things. And I think Sony, I think Fuji did this on purpose just to get you to go to the higher end models like this, the custom 1, 2, 3, 4. You can't configure those to videos, which that kind of sucks. There's also the autofocus. Now, the autofocus is hugely improved over the XT2. Well, if you have an XT3, XT4, you're going to have the same autofocus if you do the updates. But the XT2, it lags behind, but this camera's always been better than I have, so it's not a huge deal. With that improved autofocus, there's not really much improvement in video autofocus. When I'm shooting video with this camera, I tried shooting my son, and the video focus was all over the place. And it's not this camera. It just, Fuji never really made any leaps and bounds, which was disappointing. Could be the lenses, but I don't want to. I'm not a videographer. I'm not going to buy a lens just to shoot video. I want to be able to have one lens to shoot stills and flip over and capture video. So, some might say, well, you're using the wrong lens, and I don't even know which one I had. I might have had maybe the 23 or 35, but those are the ones I'm planning to shoot when I'm on vacation. So they might not work good for video, and other people might have options to work around that. I'm not working around options. I really want to have a camera that will work for me in my different environments and the different shooting modes. So those are things that are really important, guys. And still a great camera, the build quality, and I'm not going to go and be repetitive of other people because the build quality is good. It's got a flippy screen and the IBIS seems to be really good, but it's the form factor, usability. To me, it just isn't there. And I like taking pictures, so whatever that improves that experience, and that's what the XT2 does for me, I'm going to continue to roll with it. So this one most likely will be going back to Amazon. Thanks guys for watching, and take care and have a good night. Bye now.